Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Ojer Axonil, Deepest Might. So Ojer Axonil is a mono red commander. He's a 4 mana 4/4 with trample. And the important ability here is if a red source you control would deal an amount of non-combat damage less than its power to an opponent, that source deals damage equal to Ojer Axonil's power instead. And that's really the mainly important part. It does have this other ability, though, that I'll cover just for the sake of completeness. When it dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control. So it transforms into a land that produces red mana, or you can tap 2 red and tap, transform it, activate only if red sources you control dealt 4 or more non-combat damage this turn, and only as a sorcery. So if for some reason you don't want to just have it go back to the command zone when it dies, and you want it to transform into Temple of Power, you can do that as well. So this main ability here, remember, it's a red source, it's non-combat damage, and it's to an opponent specifically. So it doesn't up the damage from that's dealt to creatures or planeswalkers. So primarily, you're going to want cards that deal obviously less than 4. So the easiest way is going to be have cards that repeatedly deal 1 damage over and over in order to burn out the opponent. So before we get to any of the other cards, let's just go over the cards that I'm calling the pingers. So these are all cards that deal 1 damage, but they don't just deal 1 damage once, they deal it multiple times. So we've got Burning Earth, 4 mana enchantment. Whenever a player taps a non-basic land for mana, it deals 1 damage to that player. So Ojer quadruples this. Every land is 4 damage. Your opponents are going to die very fast. Mana Barbs is the same thing, but it's just any land period, not just non-basics. Then you've got various creatures that trigger when you cast an instant or sorcery. So Electrostatic Field, 2 mana, 0/4. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, so obviously quadruple that up to 4 damage. There's Erebor Flamesmith, which does the same thing. And Thermo Alchemist is it has tap to deal 1 to each opponent, and it untaps when you cast an instant or sorcery. Then, less restrictive than just instant or sorceries, there's Firebrand Archer. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, so it doesn't have to be specifically an instant or sorcery, deal 1 damage to an opponent. Kessig Flame Breather does the same thing. We also have Sawblade Scamp, which is tap to remove an oil counter to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it. Then we just have straight up Spear Spewer, tap to deal 1 damage to each player. And then we've got the cards that trigger when something enters. So Reckless Fireweaver deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever an artifact enters. Woody Roastmaster is 1 damage to each opponent whenever another creature enters. And Impact Tremors is whenever a creature enters, deal 1. And then we've got the cards that deal 1 damage for other reasons. So Roiling Vortex is just 1 damage to a player every upkeep. So whenever it's your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to you. It also has the additional ability to deal 5 whenever a player casts a spell for free. So Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, Lotus Petal, Force of Will, any of that sort of stuff is going to deal 5 to players. And it also shuts off life gain by paying a single red mana if that is relevant in your match. There's Urabrask, which produces a red mana whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, but it also deals 1 damage to an opponent. So this is a good way to pseudo storm off. If you have a sufficient number of instants or sorceries, you can just keep generating red mana. There's Pyrohemia, deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. So it's a essentially sweeper for small creatures that also then doubles up as a way to just continuously deal 1 or 4 damage when you have Ojer in play. And lastly, there's Sardian Avenger. So this is 2 mana, 1/1 first strike and trample. Whenever it attacks, it gets +X/+O until end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts your opponents control. And then the important part of the pinging ability, whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to that player. So these are all of our pinging. Now, some of these just work alone. So like Burning Earth, Mana Barbs, Pyrohemia, like these cards just work alone. Other cards are, of course, going to want you to play certain things. So Reckless Fireweaver makes you want to play lots of artifacts. All of the spell pingers like Electrostatic Field, Erebor make you want to play instants and sorceries. Firebrand Archer, Kessig Flame Breather make you want to play just any non-creature spell, period. So we are going to have to build our deck specifically to enable all of these cards to work. So coming back to the top, we've just got some cheap artifact cantrippers. So Astrolabe, Chromatic Sphere, and Chromatic Star. These are just ways to pay 1 mana to filter them into another card that can trigger any of the things that trigger off of artifacts entering or casting non-creature spells. It's going to kind of similarly be the same deal with Faithless Looting and Overmaster, which protects our next instant or sorcery from being countered. And then we've got all of these various spells down here, which are either just straight up ways to draw lots of cards like the One Ring, or they're ways of drawing at least 2 cards. So Bitter Reunion, Reckless Impulse, Saheeli's Lattice, Thrill of Possibility, Tormenting Voice, Wild Guess, Witch's Mark, and Ren's Resolve. These are all cards that either Impulse, exile the top 2, and then you can cast them, or that discard a card to draw another card. These are just more ways of triggering all of our spellcast related pingers while not going down on cards. And we've got Wheel of Fortune and One Ring for good measure. Birgi can also either be a way to add red mana on its front side or on its back side, discard things to impulse draw. Obviously we're in mono red, we need some interaction, so we've got our counter spells. We've got various forms of fast mana, with the big standout cards being Birgi, Urabrask, and Stormkiln Artist. Our lands are pretty straightforward. We've got a whole bunch of Snow Mountains, Gemstone Caverns, Cavern of Souls to make sure Ojer doesn't get countered, Ancient Tomb, Blast Zone, and Underdark Rift, which is a land that can double as a removal spell if we're missing one. The reason that we're so high on these Snow Mountains and have so few non-basics is going to become apparent. So one of them is because of Burning Earth, meaning if we have this in play, we won't take as much damage from it, because most of our lands are Snow Mountains anyway. But we also have stacks cards that I'm going to get to in a bit that care about non-basic lands, so we want to make sure that we're not blowing up our own mana base. Lots of protection. Again, we're a mono red deck. We want to make sure that we can get Ojer down without it getting countered or killed, and we want to make sure that that remains the case. So Bolt Bend, Ricochet Trap, Deflecting Swat, Defense Grid. These are all cards that can help us get through counters or make sure that Ojer doesn't die to removal. Bunch of ramp, some more removal, Chaos Warp, Wild Magic Surge. And then we've got our stacks cards. So Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon are obvious inclusions. But then we also have Ruination, destroy all non-basics, and From the Ashes, destroy all non-basics. And then the controllers of those non-basics get to search out a basic land for each one that was destroyed. And then the very last one, this one is just not categorized under anything. It's Sulfim. If a source you control will deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. And notably, it and Ojer are both replacement effects, so you can order them however you want. So you can order Ojer first, taking our 1 damage cards up to 4 damage, and then have this apply second so that it doubles that, so it turns every ping into 8 damage. So just to recap, we want to get Ojer into play. We want to have any and as many of these pinging spells as we can get. We want to protect Ojer, and then we want to just burn our opponents out. Or failing any of that, or just as a backup plan, we can go the stacks route and Moon or Armageddon basically our opponents out of the game. And yeah, that is Ojer, Axonil, Deepest Might.